Good morning. Now we have another topic to discuss. This time it's about the different philosophers and their big ideas. To proceed, let's have Saint Thomas Aquinas, known to be the angelic doctor and famous philosophers during the Middle Ages. Saint Thomas Aquinas was the 13th century Dominican friar, theologian, and doctor of the church, born in what is known today as the Lazio region in Italy. His most important contribution to Western thought is the concept of natural theology that is sometimes referred to as Thomism, in tribute to his influence. This belief system holds the existence of God is verified through reason and rational explanation opposed to the scripture of religious experience. That is because Aquinas believed in the Aristotelian principles of realism, which holds that there are certain absolute that exist in the universe, including the universe itself. He actually focused on the work of reconciling Aristotelian and Christian principles, but he also expressed a doctrine or a doctrinal openness to Jewish and Roman philosophers, all to the end of divining truth wherever it could be found. Saint Thomas Aquinas actually believed that man is a substantial body union of body and soul, and that man's soul relies from the body's capacity for the sensations in order to reach out the world. Man's body moves according to the dictate of the soul, and that man is existent being in the private world and of God, in whom essence and existence are one. Next, we have Aristotle. So Aristotle is among the most important and influential thinkers and teachers in human history, often considered alongside his mentor Plato to be the father of Western philosophy. Aristotle is said to be the most prolific in Greek philosophers. He was born in northern part of ancient Greece, and his writings and ideas on metaphysics, ethics, knowledge, and methodological inquiry are the very root of human thought. Aristotle's ideas asserted the use of logic as a method of arguments, offered the basic methodological template for analytical discourse. Well, we all know logic is a science of correct thinking. So in here, we try to understand the logical connections of the argument, that the conclusion should flow logically from the premises. Espouse the understanding that knowledge is built from the study of things that happen in the world, and that some knowledge is universal, a prevailing set of ideas through Western civilizations thereafter. Defined metaphysics as the knowledge of immaterial being, and used this framework to examine the relationship between the substance, a combinations of matter and form, and the essence from which he devises that man is comprised from the unity of the two. So Aristotle believed that man is a rational animal, and that man is not a dichotomy of body and soul, and that man is a material being which has the capacity to receive life. Man's soul acts as the perfect realizations of the body, and that man acts according to what he thinks is right. Man's goal of life is happiness, and that man is not the only living thing in the universe. That's why he classifies the soul into three kinds. Okay, there he called the vegetative soul, which is the soul for the plants that they use to reproduce, feed, and grow. And there is also a soul for the animals, to which he called the sensitive soul that acts according to what they feel. Then we have the rational soul, and that is for the man to think and reason out. The next, we have the Chinese philosopher Confucius. He is a teacher, writer, and philosopher, viewed himself as a channel for the theological ideas and values of the imperial dynasties that came before him. Confucianism would engage in historic push-pull with the philosophies of Buddhism and Taoism, experiencing ebbs and flows in influence. Its high points coming during the Han, Tang, and Song dynasty. Actually, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism shares common philosophical principles. Confucius' big ideas develop in the belief of both personal and governmental morality through the qualities of justice, sincerity, and positive relationship with others. He put high regards on the strong family bonds, family relationship, including respect for elders and veneration for the ancestors, and the marital loyalty. So the Chinese were actually putting high regards into familial relationship. He believed in the value of achieving ethical harmony through skilled judgment rather than knowledge of rules, and denoting that one should achieve morality through self-cultivation. Then we have Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes is actually the father of modern philosophy. He's a French philosopher, mathematician, and scientist born in France, spent 20 years in life in Dutch Republic. As a member of the Dutch States Army, then as the Prince of Orange and subsequently as stadtholder, a position of national leadership in the Dutch Republic. Descartes wielded considerable intellectual influence over the period of the Dutch Golden Age. He often distinguished himself by refuting or attempting to undo the ideas of those that came before him. Descartes' ideas believe in all things that are not absolutely certain, emphasizing an understanding of that which can be known for sure. Recognized as the father of analytical geometry, he regarded as one of the leading influences in the scientific revolution, a period of intense discovery, revelation, and innovations that rippled through the Europe between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment eras, roughly speaking during the 15th and 18th century. Descartes believed that man is a finite substance, and that man is a substance divided into two particular substance, yung soul-thinking substance and the body-extending substance. Man's soul is not a principle of life. For man as thinking, substance happens to be one of the functions only of the soul, and that man's body as an extending substance can move without the soul. Man's body as an extending substance can move without the soul, that man's existence find its meaning and value through himself. A man can only gain true knowledge the moment he learns doubt, the moments he learns when he doubts for everything. Then we have Ralph Waldo Emerson. Let's see kung nandito siya. Ralph Waldo Emerson is a Boston-born writer, philosopher, and poet, a father of transcendentalist movement. This is a distinctively American philosophical orientations that rejected the pressures imposed by society regarding materialism. He organized the religion in favor of the ideals of individualism, freedom, and personal emphasis on the soul's relationship with the surrounding natural world. So transcendental is a movement or a philosophical school of thought that explains that man should transcend. You go beyond your limitations and you don't make an excuse for your limitations. Next is the Michel Foucault. He's an historian, social theorist, and philosopher. I don't know if it is a Michel or Michel Foucault. So in any case, he's born in riverfront city of Poitiers, France, dedicated much of his teaching and writing to the examinations of power and knowledge and their connection to social control. Active in movements against racism, human rights abuses, prisoners abuses, and marginalizations of the mentally ill. He is often cited as a major influence in movements of social justice and human rights and feminism. He actually held the convictions of the study of philosophy must begin through the close and ongoing study of history. He demanded that social construct be more closely examined on hierarchical inequalities as well as through an analysis of the corresponding fields of knowledge supporting these unequal structures. He also believed that when man is oppressed, they have these tendencies, or they were entitled to the rights, that they have the duty to rise up against an arms when the power tends to be abused, so that they can protect their rights. They were entitled to rise up against an arms to protect their rights. David Hume, he's a Scottish-born historian, economists, and philosophers, often grouped with thinkers such as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Sir Francis Bacon as part of the movement called the British Imperialism. He was focused on creating the naturalistic science of man that delves into the psychological conditions defining human nature. His belief system would help to inform the future movements of utilitarianism and logical positivism, and would have profound impact on scientific and theological discourse thereafter. He actually argued against the moral absolute, instead of positing that our ethical behavior and treatment of others is compelled by emotions and sentiments in internal passions, that we are inclined to positive behaviors by their likely desirable outcomes. David Hume's, according to him, man's knowledge comes from existence. All men possesses benevolence, that means the act of kindness, which is the basis of his moral judgment. The existence of God could not be proved nor disproved. That was according to David Hume. Next is Emmanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is one of the most important philosophers in the world. He's a Prussian-born, therefore identified as a German philosopher, considered among the most essential figures in modern philosophy, advocate reason as the source for morality, and thinker whose ideas continue to permeate ethical, epistemological, and political debate. To his own way of thinking, Kant was pointing a way forward by resolving a central philosophical impasse. Kant's big ideas define the categorical imperative, the idea that there are intrinsically good and moral ideas to which we all have a duly, and that rational individuals will inherently find reason in adhering the moral obligation. He argued that humanity can achieve a perpetual peace through universal democracies and international cooperation. He also believed that man cannot think of the mind and its object as separate things. Man's mind must be actively involved in its object, and man's proper guide to life is the gospel. Next is Søren Kierkegaard. He's the father of existentialists. A Danish theologian, social critic, and philosopher, Kierkegaard is viewed as many as the most important existentialist philosopher. His work dealt largely with the idea of the single individual. His thinking tended to prioritize concrete reality over abstract thought, and that he's focused on the importance of the individual's subjective relationship with God. And his work addressed themes of faith, Christian love, and human emotion. He's a proponent in theistic existentialists. He viewed actually that man struggled to exist by disassociating himself from the crowd existence, and that man has to consider his individual existence not in terms of his being by a biological entity, a political entity, a psychological entity, or social entity, but in terms of being a human individual who designated to own his life, to master his life, and to frame his life, and to consider his own values. He explored the ideas of objective versus subjective truths. He argued that theological assertions were inherently subjective and arbitrary because they could not be verified or invalidated by the science. So this is a very difficult one to argue with, because when it comes to the knowledge and our relationship to God, so that varies differently, knowing that we have a different religion. Was highly critical on the entanglement between the state and the church, and first described the concept of angst defining the dread that comes from anxieties over choices, freedom, and ambiguous feeling. Next, we have Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, lived in the 16th and 14th century before Christ era. Historians differ on exactly when Lao Tzu lived and taught, but it's largely held in sometime between the 16th and 14th century before Christ era. He was also called the Old Master, founded the philosophical Taoism. Taoism is equally rooted in religion and philosophy. In traditional telling, though Lao Tzu never opened a formal school, he worked as an archivist for the royal court of Zhou dynasty, and Lao Tzu was living embodiment of the philosophy known as Taoism, the author of its primary text that is called Tao Te Ching. He argued and urged the individuals to achieve the state of Wu Wei, the freedom from desire, which causes the sufferings of man, and an early staple tenet of Buddhist tradition thereafter. Next is John Locke. John Locke is an English physicist and philosopher, prominent thinker during the Enlightenment period, and then regarded as an important contributor to the development of the social contract theory, and is sometimes called as the father of liberalism. His philosophy is said to have figured prominently into the formulations of the Declarations of Independence that initiated America's war for independence from the British. He was the one coined the term tabula rasa, or blank state, to denote that the human mind is born unformed and that the ideas or rules are only enforced through the experience thereafter. He established and forced through the experience introspection, focusing on one's own emotions and behaviors in search for the better understanding of the selves. He argued in order to be true, something must be capable to be repeated testing, a view that guided ideology with the intent of scientific rigor. Next is Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli is one among the most influential and widely debated history thinkers. His most prominent works describe as the parameters of effective rulership, in which he seems to advocate man leadership by any means which retain power, including deceit, murder, and oppression. He famously asserted that while it would be best to be both loved and feared, the two rarely coincide, and thus greater security is found in the latter, and that is fear. According to him, man acts right only under compulsion or force to do, and that man changes master willingly, hoping that to better himself. All men are bad and ever ready to display their vicious nature wherever they may find occasion to do it. Next is Karl Marx. So Karl Marx is a German-born economist and political theorist and philosopher. He wrote some of the most revolutionary philosophical content ever produced. He predicted the inequalities and violence inherent in capitalism would ultimately lead into its collapse. In many ways, Karl Marx presided over the philosophical revolution that continues in the present day of myriad forms of communism, socialism, socialized democracy, and grassroots political organization. He advocated a view called the historical materialism, arguing for the mystifications of the thought and idealism in favor of closer acknowledgement of the physical material action shaping the world. He characterized capitalism as the production system in which there are inherent conflicts of the interest between the bourgeois, which is the ruling class, and the proletariat or the working class. So these conflicts are couched in the idea that the latter, the working class, must sell the labor to the ruling class for wages that offer no stake in production. So Karl Marx is known with capitalism idea. John Stuart Mill, he is a both economist and a public servant and philosopher. John Stuart Mill is considered in modern social political theory. He contributed a critical body of work to the school of thought called liberalism, an ideology founding the extensions of individual liberties and economic freedoms. Mill was also a proponent of utilitarianism, which holds that the best action is one that maximizes utility, or stated more simply, one that provides the greatest benefit of all, or benefit to all. Si Nietzsche is a poet Nietzsche, a cultural critic and philosopher, as well as possessors of among of the most gifted minds in human history. He's a German thinker's system of ideas would have profound impact on the Western world, contributing deeply to intellectual discourse both during and after his life. He favored in perspectivism, which held that the truth is not objective and that it is consequence of various factors affecting individual perspective. Well, when we come to define situations, we really have different perspectives onto that because we have different backgrounds of experiences. He articulated ethical dilemma as the tension between the master versus the slave morality. The former in which we make decisions based on the assessment of consequences, and the latter in which we make decisions based on our conceptions of good versus evil. He also believed in the individual's creative capacity to resist social norms and cultural conventions in order to live according to the greater set of virtues. Then we have Plato. Plato is a Greek philosopher and teacher who did nothing less than found his first intuitions of higher learning in the Western world, establishing the Academy of Athens and cementing his own status as the most important figure in the development of the Western philosophical tradition. As the pupil of Socrates and the mentor of Aristotle, Plato is the connecting figure in what might be termed the great triumvirate of Greek thought in both philosophy and science. Plato's big ideas express the view often referred to as Platonism, that those beliefs are limited only to the perceptions are failing to achieve a higher level of perception, one available only to those who can see beyond the material world. Okay, he actually formulated this. He presented the allegory of the cave. Plato's allegory of the cave, wherein he said to that not every perception is true. Not all our perception cannot only be understood to be true. See, he explained it through the allegory of the cave. He articulated the theory of forms and belief that the material world is apparent and constantly changing world, but another, invisible, that provides a changing causality of all that we see. For him, everything is an abstract objects that exists in the third realm, propositions requiring number sets truth values. si Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a writer and philosopher and unique among entrants on this list, composers of operas and classical compositions born in Geneva. Then a city-state in the Swiss Confederacy, Rousseau would be the most consequential thinkers in the Enlightenment era. His ideas of human morality, inequality, and most importantly on the right to rule would have an enormous and definable impact of not just on thinking in Europe, but on the actual power dynamics within the Western civilization. He wrote extensively on educations and on advocating for the education that emphasizes the development of individual moral character. Is sometimes credited as an early proponent of child-centered education. Then we have Jean-Paul Sartre. He is a French novelist, activist, and philosopher, leading the exponent of the 20th century existentialist movement, as well as the vocal proponent of Marxism and socialism. He advocated for resistance to oppressive social constructs and argued for the importance of achieving an authentic way of being. His writing coincided with and contrasted with the sweep of fascism through Europe, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and the spread of Nazis. Sartre's big ideas believe that humans are condemned to be free, and that because there is no creator who is responsible for our action, each of us alone is responsible for everything that we do. So he does not believe in God. We don't have an obligation to weigh in our actions as when the time comes. So he does not believe in God. Next is Socrates, a necessary inclusion by virtue of his roles as essentially the founder of Western philosophy. Socrates is nonetheless unique among entrants in this list for having produced no written works reflecting his key ideas or principles. And because Socrates is best known as a teacher of thought and insights, it is perhaps appropriate that his most widely recognized contribution is a way of approaching education that remains fundamentally relevant until today. He also attributed the statement, "I know that I know nothing," to denote the awareness of his ignorance. So that is actually the philosophy that he said, no, that we actually into the admission, the desire to admit that we don't know everything. So that's how finding truth and getting wisdom to start with. He believed in misdeeds were the consequences of ignorance, that those who engage in non-virtuous behavior did so because they didn't know better. And last, but not the least, Ludwig. Born in Austria to a wealthy family, Wittgenstein is one of the philosophy's more colorful and unusual characters. They believe a life is eccentricity and professionalism, nomadism, dabbling in academia, military service, education, and even as a hospital orderly. His investigations of linguistics and psychology would have proved particularly revelatory, offering a distinctive window through which is newly understand the nature of meaning and the limits of human conceptions. He argued that conceptual confusions about language is the basis for most intellectual tension in philosophy. He resolved that because of the thought is inextricably tied to the language, and because language is socially constructed, we have no real inner space for the realizations of our thoughts, which is to say that the language of our thoughts renders our thoughts inherently socially constructed. And that's it. That ends up my discussion. Thank you.
For more ICCT College's video updates, please subscribe and click the notification button.